Good afternoon and welcome again to this fantastic Baroque masterpiece. And yet again, as last time, I have to tell you all to suspend your interest in what you see around you, suspend your admiration of the best of British Baroque, and you have to put yourself into a quite different situation. A smallish Biedermeier music room in an Austrian house in the early 19th century. Last time we were talking about the position of Vienna as the center of the musical universe in the 19th century, how that came about, the various reasons, political, commercial, religious, as well as artistic, and also debating why it couldn't possibly ever happen again that you would have such a concatenation of great names during a very short space of time. Just by the laws of statistics, you cannot again have Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert all crammed into that small area geographically and that small area chronologically. So, staying today with Schubert as our main topic, since he was the only Viennese, I thought it would be worth just considering some of the descriptions that we carry in our head, I think automatically, of what we assume an early Romantic composer should be, or the way he should behave, and just check it out against the actual facts of Schubert. We expect a Romantic composer, I think, to be somebody who was obviously independent, probably quite difficult, not at all fond of taking orders from anybody, frequently very wildly possessed, either by inspiration or by alcohol or drugs or all three. Probably without a lot of social graces. We are brought up, I think, with the idea of a rather brusque sort of person, not an elegant salon composer. Probably, we imagine, pretty intolerant of the technical and physical difficulties of performing the music that he wrote. An inspired mind being way above the requirements of ordinary musicians' techniques. It had to be somebody also who is uniquely inspired. That is, we want to hear not somebody who is good at turning out yet another cantata in the mid-Baroque idiom, but somebody who is speaking a unique language, separable from his neighbors, and not to be mistaken for any other composer, nor the message at all derivative of any other composer or artist around. So, indebted to no one, and usually badly dressed and quite often not very well washed. Well, with this picture of somebody leading a rather abnormal lifestyle, go also the ideas that this uniquely inspired Romantic composer would tend towards the revolutionary end of the scale. It would at least associate with young revolutionaries rather than the conservative element, and would obviously forego such normal conventions as marriage, for example, and of course then usually died young, probably of syphilis. If you apply all these conditions of this, I think, quite normal image of the Romantic composer to Schubert, the only one that actually fastens on with any credibility is, unfortunately, the last one. He did die young, and it was probably from syphilis. But nearly everything else in that list of criteria that we expect to find exemplified by such composers, these things don't apply to Schubert. He had, of course, as you should, as a young Romantic, a rather short composing life. His composing years were really only 15 years in which he was able to devote himself to composing. In that time, he managed, just in the chamber music area alone, which gives you, I think, one of the best pictures onto Schubert's thinking, he managed a total of 15 string quartets, 2 piano trios, an octet, the Trout Quintet that we will hear today. Don't forget his vocal music, all those songs, 600 and more of the songs. And of course, don't forget the operas. You never see or hear them nowadays, but there are quite a few. The church music, again, rarely heard, but lots of it. The keyboard music, you do hear many of his piano pieces, and for the last lecture we heard that amazing F minor fantasy for 4 hands on one piano, and the symphonies. That's a lot in 15 years. The other thing to remember about this output, though, in Schubert's case, in spite of what we've already considered about the commercial and aristocratic elements of the Viennese setting, most of these works were not commissioned from Schubert, and very few of them were properly paid for. So he did suffer, as all romantics had to suffer, from cash flow anxiety, I think is what you call it nowadays. And so in that way he does fit into our picture of the romantic composer. Today we've chosen a happy piece. Not everything to do with Schubert was happy, but I thought it would be quite good to examine what he did in the case of really 2 familiar works linked by one song. The song The Trout, which was an all-time favorite even in his lifetime, and the quintet that derives from it, and just look at how these how this quintet arrived at being written. It's the result of a very nice summer holiday. When he was 22, he went on a walking tour around Upper Austria with one of his closest friends, was Johann Vogel. It was Vogel who was the singer who actually at all those Schubertiad evenings was the main performer of Schubert's songs. So this was the man who sang probably at least 400 of those 600 songs. As I say, they were both young musicians. They finished up in Vogel's hometown, or rather home village, Steyr, where there was a sort of alpine arts colony. And there they were introduced, or at least Schubert was introduced to Vogel's friend, the mainstay of the town. This was a man called Sylvester Baumgarten. And he made his money, quite a lot of it, from having the monopoly on the iron mine that operated there. But he also went out of his way to be an arts patron, held elaborate musical evenings, and, casting eyes on Schubert, he said, aha, now I can commission a work from this young composer and use it in my musical evening. Schubert, of course, agreed. It sounds all, of course, rather too beautiful and effortless, and not the sort of life a composer was supposed to wander into a sunny village and immediately be commissioned to write a piece. There were 2, I won't call them snags, but 2 conditions that applied. One was that Baumgartner was already organizing musical concerts with a group of his friends, and they had in mind a musical evening performing, this is right, gets a little bit curious. They were going to perform the Hummel Septet. This was a piece scored for piano, flute, oboe, horn, viola, cello, and double bass. A rather awkward combination. It's actually a fabulous piece, but even Hummel found it was quite a difficult combination, and he tried to oblige the public by making a reduction of it. So he took the music of the septet, reduced it so that it could be fitted onto a piano quintet, but not the normal quintet. That is, not a piano plus a string quartet, but a piano plus the instruments you see waiting patiently here. So it's one of everything. 1 violin, 1 viola, 1 cello, all these you would expect to see. Probably the one you would not expect to see would be the double bass. Not always a feature of chamber music groups, and certainly not of small chamber music groups like this. So There is a theory that there was another Hummel piece, which is a quintet based on this group, and that influenced Schubert. You can discount it because now we know it hadn't even been published. Nobody knew it at the time that he wrote. So this musical evening was based around more music for this group, which had already arisen from an adaptation of another composer's existing septet. It's all rather a long trail to arrive at a rather unusual combination. The interesting thing is that Schubert immediately said yes. No standing on dignity and saying, I don't feel inspired to write for this extraordinary group, especially with an extraordinary double bass in the middle of it. I will take it on and I will write you a piece. Second catch, snag or condition was that Baumgarten was very fond of the song, The Trout, and asked that some reference to this be included, if possible, a set of variations. The problem with the Trout, of course, that it was already a very overworked song. It had circulated in many versions. Poor Schubert being asked to turn out yet another version of this overexposed piece. Again, contrary to the normal romantic model, he didn't object in the least. He said, yes, of course, I can add references to the Trout song throughout the quintet, and you can hear them in nearly every movement. Plus, I can add a set of variations on this theme for you, and we can find hidden depths, or at least new territories into which we can lead it. So this was all, I think, rather contrary to the willful, independent, difficult romantic composer. Totally obliging, completely sunny piece. The drawback, of course, for Schubert's career was that Baumgarten did play the piece, of course, with his friends a little while later, after Schubert had written it and posted it to him from Vienna. As far as we know, he did pay, and as far as we know, that was it. It wasn't played again, and it wasn't published until a year after Schubert was dead. So it was 10 years later. So in fact, nobody else knew this quintet at all. So that sets, I think, a very select position for the work and the easiness with which Schubert took orders from his patron. There were other problems, of course, waiting for him, and these are problems that all musicians are aware of. It is an unusual combination. It is not, as I said, a grouping of piano plus string quartet. It's usually quite easy to pick up a string quartet and add them to a piano, and you're guaranteed many performances, and there are many piano quintets for exactly that combination. There are hardly any for this rather difficult combination. Do you play any other quintet for this group? It isn't. And did you have to do an awful lot of telephoning around and manipulating of timetables to enable you in the academy to get together in this formation? There is nothing else for you to do except be cast specifically for this. I think that's an initial drawback commercially to the piece, that it is on. There are other works written for quintet. There are actually two that predate this. So Schubert wasn't entering into this for the first time. Whether he knew the other ones, it's doubtful. One's by John Kramer in 1803. There's another quintet for exactly this combination with bass by Ferdinand Ries, which he might possibly have come across. After that, it's the Trout Quintet, and following on from the Trout Quintet, you get periodically people who think, what a shame all these people gave up their day in order to play this one quintet. Let's write another quintet for them. So there's quite a line. Franz Limmer, Louise Farrenc, she wrote two. Hermann Goetz, I've never heard it. Tobias Picker, I have heard that, and it's not my favorite quintet. And there's the most recent one I found is by Stephen Butler, which is 1998. So if you wanted to become a permanent Trout Quintet group, you do have 7 or 8 pieces you could play. But within this group, there are inbuilt, not problems, but inbuilt things that the composer has to think about. One, as I say, is that for practical reasons it has to be specially assembled. The other thing is this addition of the double bass. It's nice to have, but it's operating in a range lower than you normally expect to hear, competing very much with the left hand of the piano. If it's down there, that's the only competition there is. It does do one useful thing, and it frees up the cello not to be the base of the structure. I think there was a reason for this, because Sylvester Paumgarten, who commissioned and paid for and got this piece performed, was the cellist. And so I think Schubert knew that the niceties of pleasing your patron involved giving him the chance to shine, not always plugging away on the bass line. So there was a little bit of discretion involved there. The problem with a group, though, that is only 1, 1, 1, 1 all the way around, is you don't have the strength of the duet. Everybody knows in a string quartet, there are certain things that can only be done because you have two violins. They can mix together as one sound, they can answer each other exactly in the same tessitura and style. There's a lot of dialogue as well as tutti effects that can be done with two of exactly the same instrument. Here it's 1 against 1 against 1 against 1. And an extra problem, which is one that Hummel, the originator of the septet and the quintet version, one that Hummel didn't overcome. That is the danger that in any group with a few string players and a grand piano, the grand piano dominates. And so you do run the risk of creating a piece that sounds like a miniature piano concerto all the way through. Schubert had to find a way of making sure that the piano, with the ability to play over the range that could obliterate all the other instruments here, was in a way took on a rather more restricted character that made it a melodic instrument. And you'll find, I think if you look at the first page of the piano part, nearly everything you've got there is written in octaves, isn't it? So the piano, instead of taking advantage of that full range of notes and the power to drown everybody out and the power to create a texture in which nobody else would be heard, is to write for a single melodic line as though the piano was a simple melodic instrument. Just play a little sample of what goes on. Both hands occupy only a single line. If you put one hand behind your back and just play something. So one has to remember, for quite a lot of this piece, although it's not always apparent, the piano is acting as an extra melodic line, not as necessarily an accompaniment or a concertante element or somebody who could take over the entire show. It's a mark of great discretion, I think, that Schubert took that line out. It does lead to difficulties, which we can talk about a little later, I think, if we want, remember, your hands are constructed like that. Schubert often writes as though you had your thumb on the same side of both hands and you could just play up and down the piano in octave with the same finger. It's not. What fits that way doesn't always, it should really be the other way around. So there's a little bit of intolerance of physical disabilities or physical limitations on the pianist. Never mind, they can be coped with. And it makes a beautiful carrying sound with few complexities. Against it, of course, you can have the self-sufficient piano that can play an accompaniment or an accompaniment to its own solo line. They are variants, but most of the ensemble work you'll find is given with the piano playing in octaves. There's one other little trick before we play you the first movement of the Trout, so you can get these sonorities in your head and see how all these elements are being put together. This is for people who like the technicalities of sonata form. When you write a sonata movement, we know there are certain rules implicit. You have an exposition, where you deliver basically two sets of ideas, first subject, second subject. They are in different keys. So the tonality is the home key, and then a second group you modulate into the dominant. So you're operating on two different tonal levels. So you begin in one key, you end up at the double bar in a different key. Then comes what's called the fantasy section. We call it the development section. The 19th century called it the fantasy section, where you go in all sorts of directions. Schubert is great at deluding you about what key you're in. You'll find when we get to the mysterious moment in the middle, everything starts to shift into keys. You cannot, I think, find your way through them, and I would defy most people to tell us, unless you have perfect pitch, exactly what tonality you're in. Everything has wandered. When you come out the other end, you are supposed to then come back to the first group of themes, the first subjects. Then by tinkering or by recomposing that link to the second group, you bring it into the same key. So you end on a stable key, both the first group and the second group in the same tonality, ending where you began. That's the very simplified version of sonata form. Schubert found a very ingenious way out of having to do any extra composing, because he worked out that if that's the relationship of your keys at the beginning, if you fooled enough with the harmony in the fantasy section, nobody would know where they are. And so you can bring back the opening higher in the dominant, so that when that same modulation occurs, the second group will come out in the correct key to end. You notice, I think it's very easy for everybody to know when you've returned to the opening material, but few people, I think, would notice that it actually is officially in the wrong key. The reason simply being Schubert was having a nice time and he didn't want to be bothered with the chore of having to recompose that link to change the relationship of these groups. You'll probably spot it now that I've told you, but here's the whole of the first movement, so you can see this group in use. And I should have said at the very start, welcome to these lovely players from the Royal Academy of Music. Thank you. I think nobody would suspect that of being done by pretty universal cut and paste. Schubert would have loved the technique available to composers with a computer now to turn out yet more works by these subterfuges. The next element I think we ought to look at is the second condition, the Baumgarten set, which is that the Trout song be included. And you have on your handouts that you may have in your hand or you may actually be sitting on, two things. You have on one side the facsimile of the song, and on the other side the German text and a translation. It's good to know that there were 5 versions of the Trout. So this is one of these problematic things for musicians and musicologists. When you talk about the Trout, and Schubert writes it 5 times, which one are you referring to? Most people tend to think the last one is the one that the composer intended, but there's no evidence that Schubert thought that one was any better than the others. The interesting thing is the last version he wrote out, which is the one you have in facsimile, now in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. It's the only version where there is a written introduction to it. So we can come and see this. Welcome to... The introduction contains the fishy element, and there's no knowing. If you write in the other 4 versions that Schubert wrote, there was no introduction there on the page. That doesn't mean to say the composer didn't improvise a little introduction. This was very normal. But the significant nuance, I think, of the song, and the thing that tends to stay in your head, is this little figure. Just give us a little fishy figure. It's a perfect... I don't know how long it took Schubert to dream that up or whether it just arrived spontaneously, but it has that wriggling sensation to it and the little chromatic inflection that is absolutely perfect for setting the scene. And the scene is innocent, you think, until it turns nasty.
Schoss in frohe Eil, die launische Forelle vorüber wie ein Pfeil. Ich stand und in Gestade und sah in süßer Ruhe des muntern Fischleins Bade im klaren Bächlein zu, des muntern Fischleins Bade im klaren Bächlein zu. Ein Fischer mit der Rute wohl an dem Ufer stand und saß mit kaltem Blute, wie sich das Fischlein wand. So lang dem Wasser her, so dacht ich nicht gebricht, so fängt die Forelle mit seiner Angel nicht, so fängt die Forelle mit seiner Angel nicht. Doch endlich ward dem Diebe die Zeit zu lang. Macht das Bächlein tückisch treiben, und ehe ich es gedacht, so zuckte seine Rute, das Bächlein zappelt dran, und ich mit regem Blut sah die Betrockne an, und ich mit regem Blut sah die Betrockne an.
notice, of course, that Schubert doesn't set the moral, the last verse of the song, which is rather interesting. Does he think the moral is sufficiently obvious? Does he think the drama of this subterfuge of muddying the waters is enough to show what the danger is? Or does he perhaps not agree with Schubert's poetic moralizing at the end? It's sometimes a bit confusing that we have Schubert, the composer, and Schubert, the poet, so closely connected. But the song, as I say, existed in 5 versions. It circulated. It was very well known. It has never, I think, been out of public consciousness. It is very memorable, very simple, and fairly moral. It crops up in so many places. One of the funniest I've come across, I think, is that strange film of Sherlock Holmes and Professor Moriarty, where Moriarty sings verses from the Trout while plotting the downfall of Sherlock Holmes, with a nice twist at the end that the Trout turns out to be a shark who actually eats the fisherman. As a nice thing. I'm also told, although I don't have personal acquaintance with this, that if you buy a certain Samsung spin dryer, it sings the Trout at you when the spin load is dry and waiting for you to take it out. I think Schubert might have been quite amused by that. It seems that he wasn't, as I said, quite as high and mighty as the Romantic composer was supposed to be. Anyway, this very well-worn song, even well-worn and well-known during Schubert's short lifetime, was what Baumgarten asked to form the basis of some part of his quintet. You've already heard certain elements, particularly that little rippling. The Trout figure is there nearly all the way through this 5-movement quintet in one guise or other. But it's most obvious, of course, when you come to the set of variations. So back we come to demonstrate this. Schubert places his set of variations, the condition for this commission, as it were, in the sort of extras position. That is, when you have a normal symphonic work, you have an opening movement, which you heard, a very beautiful slow movement, a scherzo, and then you're waiting for the finale. It's that moment between the scherzo, or sometimes the minuet, and the finale, which is where you put your extras. So already we know that Schubert felt these variations were not perhaps a prime element of a symphonic plan, but they were put in deliberately in this nice waiting position. And then we can see what he decided to do with this melody. Well, take it in perhaps in order of obviousness. The first thing you could obviously do is just simply take the song, give it to the violin, and the accompaniment to the piano, and this is what you'd get. And the accompaniment there is not the little fishy element. Just play the figure. And the real fishy, the squirmy bit, which is what I find sticks in my mind immediately, only comes when we come to the second half of the tune, and then we're back on home territory. This is the Trout song. This is not the order in which Schubert delivers these ideas, but this is the sequence of obviousness, I would say, that in fact forms the coda. So you don't get the origin of these variations till the very end. What you do have at the beginning, though, is quite an obvious idea. Okay, that was a song. Let us make something of the song which makes it sound as though it was exactly suited to a string group, probably a string quartet, in a style that's almost identical with that of Haydn for example, delivering the Austrian national anthem as the theme of the Emperor Quartet. And this is the song delivered without any piano, just as a string unit. Looks as though the piano has been forgotten, so the next obvious thing to do is reinstate the piano as top dog, and the strings accompany. Extra twiddles, but I think the melody is pretty obviously the song melody decorated a little by the piano. Everybody else very subservient. Next thing to do then is to try to establish some equality between the instruments here. The one instrument you'll notice that we haven't heard very much from all the time is the viola. Have you appeared in any solo part so far? I think hardly. You've heard plenty of cello, you've certainly heard the bass, you've heard tons of piano, you've heard lots of high-lying violin. Somehow the viola has gone overlooked. Here's a variation where the theme is given to the viola and everybody else adopts pretty deferential positions. At least we're all absolutely identical. This is variation 2. Important rule about writing to commission, of course, that Schubert was well aware of: don't forget your patron. Baumgarten, who was paying for all this, was the cello. And so you have to then include something that shows the cello off in a slightly more flattering guise than merely just decorating the tune. What happens in the cello variation is the cello takes the Trout melody and wanders off into new territories. This is not any longer the song. This is an element of the song being set free. I were Baumgarten, I would be very happy paying up for that. One thing's missing. We've had a lot of solos and nice balance or imbalance organized between the instruments. Has there been a great deal of drama? No. So insert a little drama quickly. Big contrast, almost hostility, minor key, but not seriously present for very long. But in all, it's a beautifully designed foil for what's going to come afterwards, which is the walk out at the end, the coda, where, as we've already heard, the obvious treatment of the song is given to you, but piecemeal. It's very nice after that drama that you're introduced back to the original melody that we remember, with its not quite right accompaniment, and only gradually does it slip into the idiom that we all know is very safely the song, and that is the architecture of the coda, which is so beautifully done. It's difficult to write constantly happy music, and I think it's difficult for performers to know sometimes what to do with something like the Trout, which is just happiness all the way through. Within the variations, I think Schubert does give you some of the ideas that you need to look for, of withholding information, of adding drama and allocating specific roles to specific people, which are then contradicted the next minute. So the piano is one moment a sort of concerto soloist, and the next moment you're just adding little comments that ratify what's going down here. We have one instrument that needs to be heard, and that is the double bass. So we have one variation where you play, just to prove the double bass can play the melody. Etc. It can be accompanied very decorously by the strings. Etc. This is just to show Schubert breaking his own rule. Now, you thought this was the moment to admire the double bass players supported by the cello, but in fact, the piano has a part in this variation too, and it's so showy, in the end, nobody listens to anything really except the piano. Put it all together, and we're sufficiently distracted from the double bass. Put all these elements together in a different sequence, and you have this extra movement, the variations on the Trout itself, which we end with today. So the complete movement. Thank you.